Hello and welcome to what will be the last episode of the TF1 show in 2019. I think it's also very appropriate for this to be the 40th episode of the TF1 show, so ending the year off on a nice and round number. So I'm very excited. I'm your host, Tinas Ferreira, and since we are now at the end of another decade, it is, after all, the end of 2019, which means 10 years of Formula One has now passed, ever since the beginning of 2010. So this episode is going to be all about us taking a quick look back at, the past 10 years and thinking about what happened in Formula One and all of the interesting and fascinating things that we can maybe touch on quickly. Now, I titled this episode, The Decade of Domination, because over the past 10 years, only 3 drivers and 2 constructors were able to win the title, with Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg winning the drivers' title, and Red Bull and Mercedes winning all 10 constructors' titles. So it's been one-way traffic and then completely the other way traffic in the second part of the decade. And but for me, the most exciting part, or the most fun part of sort of preparing for this episode and thinking about what I wanted to talk about today was just, it's crazy to think how far we've come over the past 10 years. If you think about the big news stories early on, let's maybe go back right to, the beginning of the 2010 season. So Jenson Button had just won his, world championship, his only world championship with Brawn, who also won the Constructors' Championship. And then obviously that whole year was a bit of a crazy year with the Brawn team basically coming out of nowhere and upsetting effectively the Red Bull team that I think was poised to start their, let's say, period of domination a year earlier than what they expected. But, Jenson Button shocked the world, saying that he will no longer be part of the Brawn team and he will move to the McLaren team to become Lewis Hamilton's teammate. And a lot of people thought at the time that was probably a mistake. If you think about the fact that Button had just won his championship with Brawn, and then also the fact that it came out that Mercedes decided to actually buy over the Brawn team and to enter Formula One as a constructor for the first time since the 1950s. Now, this was obviously massive news because Mercedes is a behemoth in terms of the automotive industry, brings massive budgets, and, if you wanted to put a cherry on top of this already very tasty looking cake, they also announced that Nico Rosberg, who was going to be driver for them, was going to be partnered by Michael Schumacher, who decided to make a comeback after having retired at the end of 2006. So this just looked like, a massive, impressive German puzzle that was put together with laser-like precision, because it was Mercedes, it was Ross Brawn who basically orchestrated the Brawn team from the year before. Ross Brawn was also instrumental and was a massive partner to Michael Schumacher and Ferrari when they won all of their titles. So it's going to be Nico Rosberg, Michael Schumacher, Ross Brawn, and then obviously the massive Mercedes company that was going to start the next decade at that point in time with a bang. And we'll obviously talk a bit more about what ended up happening with Mercedes, but just, a completely different landscape in Formula One at the beginning of the decade, obviously with Red Bull, with starting their domination. Adrian Newey fully exploited the new regulations and came up with what they called the blown diffuser. And you can go and listen to some of my previous episodes where I discuss Red Bull's domination more specifically and discuss sort of how impactful Adrian Newey was in this rise of Red Bull. But effectively in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, Red Bull, they were the team to beat with the fastest car throughout those 4 seasons, but not without some challenges and some challengers coming to the fore. If you think about 2010 specifically, 2010 was probably one of my favorite seasons in Formula One. I know a lot of people really like the 2012 season, and I'll talk about that one a bit later. But 2010 for me was just so incredible to watch, just because it was three teams that were quite closely matched. I think on balance, Red Bull was probably still the strongest, but there were tracks where McLaren and Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button were strong. There were tracks where Fernando Alonso and Ferrari was strong. So it was just sort of a very, very tightly contested close championship fight with, I think there still being 4 people in contention for the title at the last race in Abu Dhabi. So that in itself tells you how intense of a season that was, and even more intensely, experienced by me was the final race. I think because if I remember correctly, Mark Webber came in with the best chance of winning the championship, with Fernando Alonso, I think, is his closest challenger, and Sebastian Vettel, I think, in third place, but definitely a bit of an outside shot in his Red Bull at that point in time. And I think Lewis Hamilton was 24 points or something behind, which basically meant that he had to win the race, and all the other 3 drivers had to retire for Hamilton to win the championship. So he wasn't really in the fight. But in any case, that Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was again one of the most dramatic races that you can think of, with both Alonso and Mark Webber failing to actually convert their lead in the points into a championship victory, and Sebastian Vettel ending up, being the championship victor after a massive struggle and a massive fight throughout the whole season. So that first season already set us up for what's going to be a very, very interesting decade in F1. Now, 2011, not as interesting from a season point of view, because Vettel and Red Bull then basically blew the field away. The blown diffuser from Adrian Newey was at its most powerful during the 2011 season. And that meant that the Red Bull was basically an unstoppable force. And it was getting difficult to see how any team or any driver was going to be able to stop the Vettel-Red Bull pairing. And then came 2012, which was another incredible season in F1. And a lot of Formula One fans look back on that season with tears in their eyes. And they just, look at it through rose-colored spectacles and say, what an incredible season that was. Because I think there was something like 7 different winners over the first 7 races. So it was all a bit of a mess. Very interesting, very entertaining. And I think odds on probably one of Fernando Alonso's strongest seasons in his Formula One career. Now let's maybe park a bit at Fernando Alonso and talk about the racing driver, or the man, the myth, the legend. Now, I think we can all agree that Fernando Alonso was one of the best racing drivers over the past decade, over the past 2 decades. I think there are arguments to be made to say that he was probably one of the best racing drivers of all time. And the fact that he only won 2 world championships is definitely, I think, if you look at the pantheon of achievements, not representative of his ability or of his talents. But the amount of heartbreak and devastation that Alonso had to go through, especially at the beginning of the decade in terms of his championship fight, would have been difficult, I think, for a lot of people to surmount and to comprehend, because he was constantly dragging a Ferrari that was most of the time the 3rd fastest car on the grid to not pole positions, but to race wins, to podiums, always, just taking that car by the scruff of the neck and putting it in places where that car had no business of being. Actually, as I mentioned, challenging for the title up until the last race of 2010. And if Fernando Alonso would have been able to overtake Vitaly Petrov's Renault, he could have been a 3-time world champion after the 2010 season. And then obviously in 2012, again, it was basically Fernando Alonso and his Ferrari up against the might that was Red Bull at the time. And again, in a much, much slower car, Fernando Alonso was keeping that championship fight alive right up until the last race, where he, again, dramatically lost it to Sebastian Vettel in Brazil. I think he just had this, he had this massive, I don't know if it was, you can't call it a mental block, because it's not a mental thing. He was mentally superior, I think, compared to everybody else. It was just the politics of Ferrari and the pressure of Ferrari and the environment at Ferrari that never led to, firstly, the team having a car that was truly, truly competitive with Red Bull, And that then meant that Fernando Alonso was constantly having to make up the difference and having to overdrive, just dragging that car over the finish line every race. And obviously, if you look back, he had a 5-year contract, I think, with Ferrari up until 2016, but he ended up pulling out of the contract early at the end of 2015 because it just got so, at the end of 2014, apologies, because it just got so frustrated with this situation that he was in, where he was sort of in touching distance of another world championship, and he just could never get there because of, maybe his own internal shortcomings or because of Ferrari shortcomings. And that then meant that he took the quite, let's say, risky decision to jump to McLaren, who at that point in time, at the end of 2014, had a bit of a rough season themselves. But Ron Dennis orchestrated this massive coup at the time, and people were clutching at their pearls and weeping tears of remembrance as they thought back to, the golden years of McLaren back in 1988, where Ayrton Senna and McLaren Honda were this unit of, this championship winning machine, and Fernando Alonso wanted a slice of that pie. And so he jumped ship and joined McLaren along with Jenson Button, since, as I was alluding to, Ron Dennis had been able to convince Honda to re-enter as a constructor. Now, we all know how that went. It was an unmitigated disaster. On my previous episode, a 2019 episode, actually, Sasha and I touched on sort of some of the reasons that it didn't work out that well. Obviously, Honda had a lot of shortcomings. The engine formula at that point was a lot more complicated than they had anticipated. McLaren wasn't managed properly as well, and the whole relationship broke down. And the tale of the tape was that Fernando Alonso never won another race in his career at McLaren, which is obviously devastating. So I think if you look back at this decade is definitely one where we can say what could have been for one of the great drivers of Formula One in Fernando Alonso. But, that's, I guess, also illustrates how fickle the world of Formula One can be. And it also illustrates to us that it's very fun for all of us to say, especially now when you look at the young guns in Verstappen and Leclerc and Lando Norris and George Russell, saying that, they're all going to probably be future world champions. But sometimes it just doesn't work out like we all predicted. You never know. Leclerc might be as we know that Leclerc just signed another 5-year extension to his Formula One contract at Ferrari, similar to the way Alonso did in the early 2000s, in 2010, more specifically. And he never won a world championship again. So you never know what's going to happen. And I think Fernando Alonso's decade or let's say 5 years at Ferrari and then 3 years at McLaren, apologies, definitely, I think, showed that. But let's get back to our discussion of sort of the passing of events during the decade. And the next very, very major, let's say, news event that happened was when at the end of 2012, after quite a successful season with McLaren, Lewis Hamilton decided to jump ship from McLaren to Mercedes after Michael Schumacher decided, after 3 fruitless years back in Formula One, that he was going to call it a day. That Mercedes was able to convince Lewis Hamilton to drop the championship winning team in McLaren and join the Mercedes project. Now, at the time, and I'll admit I was one of those people, I thought this was stupid. I thought this was madness from Hamilton. I thought it was like Rafael Nadal deciding that tennis is no longer for him and that he'd rather become a prima ballerina. Because at that point in time, I think Mercedes had won 1 race in Shanghai, or 2 races, I'm not sure. I think 1 race in 2012. But other than that, it was a struggle for the Mercedes team. They had massive issues with tire management. They couldn't get the car where they wanted to be. They were constantly being outperformed by, obviously, Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull. But then Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, apologies. And also Renault at that point in time Lotus had shown that they were a force to be reckoned with as well. So at that point, Lewis Hamilton basically told McLaren, I don't want your championship winning cars. What I want is to join a team that hasn't really proven itself at all, and that Mercedes basically sold Hamilton a dream, and that he's now going to go pick up sticks and go all the way to Mercedes and try and make things happen for him there. Now, we all know in hindsight what a inspired decision that was, but truly at the time, all of us were thinking that Hamilton must be an incredibly impulsive decision after suffering some reliability issues at McLaren during the 2012 season, that he basically decided that he will now make a change, and that might be the anchor that drags Hamilton's career right down to the bottom of the ocean. But what we didn't know is that Niki Lauda and Ross Brawn at the time effectively showed Hamilton the light and showed him that the massive regulation change that was coming up in 2014, with a whole new engine formula and a whole new aerodynamic philosophy, that Mercedes were way, way, way ahead of the curve when compared to their rivals. And I think, having shown that to Lewis Hamilton, I think he realized that actually it might be a very, very good move for him to jump ship the year before the new regulations kicked in. And obviously it was a golden opportunity for him to join Mercedes, since Schumacher was leaving at the end of 2012. And the rest was history, as they say. Now, the first year that Hamilton joined Mercedes, I think there were already some green shoots of life, if you can call it that, for the Mercedes team, where they won a couple of races. I think Rosberg won 2 and Hamilton won 1, and they finished quite high up in the Constructors' Championship as well, with Hamilton being 4th and Rosberg being 5th in the championship in 2013. But then obviously the turbo hybrid era kicked in, and then we saw effectively what Lauda had promised Hamilton early on when he decided to join Mercedes, because Rosberg and Hamilton were way out in front in 2014. I think even during testing, everybody knew that this year, the 2014 season, was basically going to be a 2-horse race between the two Mercedes drivers, with the main reason for that being that this new engine formula, this new engine regulations was so massively complicated that Renault and Ferrari both completely underestimated the amount of work and the amount of testing that they had to put in to these engines, and the amount of development time that these engines required. And that effectively meant that Red Bull, who is obviously a customer to Renault, and then the Ferrari team itself, were fighting with their hands behind their back. And that meant that because the Mercedes engine was so far ahead of the rest, and because Ross Brawn and his team at the time when they were developing it had the wherewithal to realize that a very important part of the success during this new era was going to be how well the engine and the car and the chassis is packaged together, and how well the two work together, that even, the Mercedes customer teams like McLaren and of course India just didn't have that whole package together like Mercedes had. And that then meant that the dawn of the Hamilton-Rosberg Mercedes era had begun, and the Vettel-Red Bull era came to a shuddering and crashing halt at the end of 2013, because, and for reasons more than the regulation change, but I'll get into that just now. But obviously during the next, 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, and now 2019 as well, it's been a clean sweep by Mercedes. Hamilton also won 5 out of the 6 championships, with Nico Rosberg pipping him at the post in 2016, which was, I think, especially during the 14 and 16 seasons, was an incredibly entertaining battle between Hamilton and Rosberg. It got quite personal, it was very dramatic, quite fractious and but nasty as well, which was obviously as a viewer of Formula One quite interesting to see. But obviously for someone like Toto Wolff, who had to manage the two of them, was basically meant a running prescription at the pharmacy for some migraine tablets. But I think there's no denying that there was such a dramatic switch in midway through, or not completely midway through, but almost halfway through the decade, from Red Bull to Mercedes, where these two teams just wiped the floor with everybody else, which made the narratives, I think, quite interesting, and also raised a lot of questions about the sustainability of Formula One and what actually a viewer needs to get out of, the show that is supposed to be Formula One, because, and rightfully so, a lot of people were upset with the fact that after the Red Bull era of domination, we basically just replaced Red Bull with another team and another set of drivers. And a lot of the same was still going on, with first and second place being a foregone conclusion, and then a lot of the action happening behind. But before we get into that in a bit more detail, let's maybe park at sort of the aftermath of what happened with Red Bull. Now, again, if you look at 2019, they're I guess still sort of rebuilding back to where they were at the beginning of the decade. But the 2014 season was a sobering one for both Red Bull and for Sebastian Vettel, because obviously Renault did not pitch up with an engine that was going to be competitive, and Red Bull was then basically a sitting duck, because it meant that no matter how good their chassis was, the Renault engine wasn't going to be able to make up the difference, and that meant they were perennial sort of runners-up, bridesmaids, I guess, if you can call it that. And secondly, for Sebastian Vettel, it was a sobering year that year in 2014, because a young new upstart from Australia came along called Daniel Ricciardo and effectively drove Vettel into the bushes, which was obviously not a great look for who at that point was a 4-time world champion, was just equaled Alain Prost for being the third most successful driver, of all time. And the tail of the tape wasn't a good read for Sebastian Vettel. He struggled with the car. He struggled to be competitive. Daniel Ricciardo won 3 races in his first year at the team. Vettel won 0 races. It was just a comprehensive beating that Ricciardo handed out to Vettel that year, which then meant, again, shock horror. And at the end of 2014, Vettel announced that actually he's no longer, part of the Red Bull team. He's now going to go to Ferrari and realize his dream of winning a world championship with the red team, similar to what Michael Schumacher was able to do, who obviously was Vettel's hero, but similar to what Schumacher was able to do with Ferrari all those years ago. Now, we all know how that went. Similar to Alonso, I guess. It was a bit of a mess for Vettel at Ferrari, who again showed some promise here and there, but at the end of the day came up short against a team that was better organized, more technically brilliant. And, it's been a bit of a weird sort of mirror image of watching one world champion in Fernando Alonso trying to win this mythical championship with Ferrari for the first 4 years in F1, or for the first 5 years. And then for the next 5 years, watching Sebastian Vettel try and do exactly the same thing and effectively coming up short in exactly the same way. So that effectively illustrates the troubles that Ferrari has been going through, and maybe some of the fundamental issues that team has had over the past 10 years. Because I think we can all agree Ferrari does not have a lack of funding. They get most of the prize money. They are a very, very well-funded team, a massive team with a lot of staff, and somehow they can't seem to put this whole puzzle together and just make everything click in the way that they were able to all those years back with Schumacher. And obviously that has some operational repercussions and some operational, causes as well, because Ferrari tends to be a team over the past 10 years that were very serious about getting results as quickly and as effectively as possible, and we're very much placing the focus on short-term results rather than the medium or the longer term, which I think definitely bit them in the behind a bit, because there were way too many firings and hirings, way too many team bosses that they decided, no, actually after 1 year, this team boss doesn't know what it's doing, so he has to go, and then replace him with another team boss who obviously in teams as big as that, with the amount of pressure that a Ferrari is facing at every race, it's going to take a bit of time for any team principal or any, technical director to find his or her feet And history has shown us that a year or 2 years or 3 years sometimes even isn't enough for a team to get back to the top, and that a team, especially to challenge a behemoth that is the Mercedes team at the moment, that a team needs some stability and some pragmatism. And that, I think, definitely, if you look back over the last 10 years, is something that Ferrari didn't have. Now, I guess we're nearing sort of the end of our discussion of the decade, but what I do want to mention is the Sebastian Vettel-Lewis Hamilton rivalry, which I think is played out in two different ways. Now, firstly, I think we were all, especially in 2017-18, were very excited with the prospect of having two multiple world champions at two different teams, two mighty, mighty powerful teams, fighting it out for the Drivers' Championship tooth and nail right up until the very end. And I think we had glimpses of what it could have been at some points in 2017, and then I think most pertinently at the beginning of 2018, where Vettel and Hamilton were sort of fighting tooth and nail for that championship lead. But disappointingly so, it never really came to the fruition that we all thought it could. It was a bit like a souffle where, we took it out of the oven and it was magnificent and it smelt delicious and you were just ready to tuck in. And then someone opened the door and the whole souffle fell flat. And that was effectively what happened right at the moment where Sebastian Vettel crashed into the barrier at Hockenheim last year, because that ended up being the last time we really saw Vettel and Hamilton go head to head this decade. And Lewis Hamilton hasn't looked back since. He's wiped the floor with Sebastian Vettel and I guess mostly everybody else. But I think if you look back at, 2015-16, where this rivalry had so much promise and we just never really saw that really coming to a point of, excellence or point of excitement that we all hoped it would, which I guess looking back is quite a big disappointment. And then the other area where obviously Hamilton and Vettel would be competing over this past decade is just in terms of their overall performance over the decade, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a bit of a two-half affair, where Vettel was the man in charge, the prima donna at Red Bull from 2010 to 2014, and then Hamilton 2013, apologies, and then Hamilton obviously from 2014 onwards up until the end of this year has been the class of the field. And we need to ask ourselves, between the two of them, who was the most impressive? And over the past decade. And for me, the answer is easy. And I think for most people, the answer is quite easy in saying that probably you'd go with Hamilton just because he made less mistakes. He was more consistent. He was in the running to win the championship in 2010, in 2012, parts of 2013, obviously 2014 up until now. Sometimes just due to his driving excellence, not only because he had the best chassis on the grid necessarily. And Sebastian Vettel's last 2 years at Ferrari especially, and also the season he had at 2014 with Red Bull, showed some relatively big gaps in his repertoire or in his ability as a driver, where if the car doesn't suit his specifications or his driving style perfectly, he tends to struggle, which is obviously not ideal for a driver that wants to market himself as one of the best on the grid and maybe one of the best of all time. So I think for me personally, that's why Lewis Hamilton probably is the driver of the decade. You guys are all happy for you guys to disagree with me and to fight me in the comments. We can have a nice constructive debate about whether Sebastian Vettel has these limitations or not. Now, before we wrap up this episode, let's just take a quick pit stop at, and I alluded to them a bit earlier on in this episode, is the new generation, the younglings, the Padawans, as it were, given it is the most recent Star Wars episode was released. What do we think is going to happen with Verstappen, with Leclerc, with Norris, with Russell. Are they as good as what we thought Hamilton and Vettel were going to be at the beginning of this decade? Basically, well, I guess at this point, last 10 years ago, Hamilton had already won his first championship. But are they going to be as successful? Is the 2021 regulations, is that going to throw a spanner in the works and somehow mean that Renault or McLaren are actually going to be the team to beat? Is Carlos Sainz going to be a world champion before any of the younglings are? I think the moral of the story is that firstly, I think Verstappen and Leclerc, and Russell, I think they are that good. I think they are incredibly talented, very capable, super fast. I think it's going to be interesting to see if it can come together for Verstappen, if it can come together for Leclerc. I saw on Twitter recently that people like to say, no, Leclerc will be world champion before Verstappen because he has X, Y, Z qualities. And I keep thinking that, yes, that's all true. But if the Ferrari is slow and the Red Bull is fast, despite Leclerc's many copious qualities, he's not going to be world champion for Max is. That whole package needs to come together. So the car and the driver and the strategy and the team and the consistency and the focus and just so many different elements in a world championship campaign that Mercedes had made look so easy over the past 5 years. And I guess Red Bull made look so easy over the 4 years before that it's going to be fascinating to see how these young guns compete. And then also how Hamilton is going to be able to compete with the young guns, and for how long he's going to want to compete with them, because I think Lewis Hamilton definitely still has the hunger and he has the talent and the experience to still give these younglings a bit of a massive headache. So much to look forward to in the next decade. And I want to hear from all of you guys. If you are keen to leave a comment or to converse with me on social media, what do you guys think is going to happen over the next decade? Who's going to be the Hamilton? Who's going to be the Red Bull? What's going to be the main talking points over the next couple of years? And I think we know definitely that the reign of Hamilton and Vettel is nearing its end, and we now have the new set of youngsters to keep us busy. And even more interestingly, the new regulations in 2021 will completely change the aerodynamic properties of the car and the way that the car is going to have to be driven. And that might throw up some curveballs as well, with, obviously different drivers having different driving styles and some driving styles might be more in line with the new regulations than what they were with this regulation. So, who knows who will rise to the top in the new future. Now, I think I will be the first one to say that the TF1 show will remain to be that annoying voice in your ear and bring you all of the interesting, scandalous, and downright idiotic things that will happen in the Formula One paddock. And I would just like to, I guess at this point, thank all of you guys for listening throughout the whole year and listen to me rabbit on and ramble on. And I'll see you all in 2020 with another season in F1. And I will also strive to hopefully keep you all entertained and keep you all informed. And I hope you guys enjoy the holidays and have a happy new year. It is, I guess, just in time. This episode is released before the end of the new year. So happy new year, everybody. And we'll chat again soon.